Malcolm Jamal Warner, dead at the age of 54 on a drowning accident while he was vacationing with his family in Costa Rica.
I am tired of running for shade. And aren't you tired of being hustled and played?
The world was stunned when news broke. Malcolm Jamal Warner, the actor who had once been America's son, was gone. At just 54 years old, he was found lifeless in Costa Rica after what officials called a drowning accident. But what has left fans completely shattered wasn't just his death. It was the words he spoke just before it happened, words that sound less like advice and more like a farewell message to the world. We're going to break it all down in this video. But before we begin, welcome back to Behind the Mask, the channel where we go deeper than the headlines, uncovering the hidden truths, the untold stories, and the emotional journeys behind the biggest names in entertainment. If you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our future deep dives. And if you've been rocking with us for a while, thank you. You already know how we do this, respectfully, thoughtfully, but without shying away from the real questions. Now, let's get into it. Because what Malcolm Jamal Warner said before his final moments wasn't random. It wasn't lighthearted. It was heavy. It was deliberate. And now that he's gone, it has taken on a haunting new meaning that fans can't stop talking about. So what were his final words? Why do they feel so prophetic? And why do they hit so much harder now that he's no longer here? By the end of this video, you'll understand why Malcolm Jamal Warner's last message has left his fans in tears, and why it may just change the way we remember him forever. It began like so many breaking news stories do, quickly, bluntly, and almost too cold for the weight of what it meant. Actor Malcolm Jamal Warner, best known as Theo Huxtable on The Cosby Show, has died at 54. The headline spread across phones, TV tickers, and social media feeds within minutes. For many people, the first reaction was disbelief. This couldn't be true. Theo Huxtable, the kid we grew up with in our living rooms, the wisecracking, lovable son of one of television's most famous families, gone? But then came confirmation. Reports from Costa Rica, statements from local authorities. The Associated Press carried the story, and suddenly, denial turned into shock. The official version was simple. Warner had been on a family vacation in Costa Rica, enjoying time away from Hollywood's chaos. On July 20th, he went swimming at Playa Limón, a beach known for strong rip currents. Witnesses say he was caught in the tide. Rescuers pulled him to shore, but by the time first responders from the Red Cross arrived, he had no vital signs. He was taken to the morgue. A tragic accident. For the media, that explanation was enough. But for fans, it wasn't.
Because something about the timing felt strange. Something about the silence surrounding his death didn't sit right. And most of all, something about the words he left behind. His final words felt too heavy to be ignored. In the hours before his passing, Warner had spoken words that sounded like a message. Words that weren't just optimistic advice, but carried the weight of a man who somehow knew his time was short.
If you can't find a reason to smile, then be the reason somebody else does. Those words, at first glance, could easily be mistaken for simple positivity, a motivational quote, something to print on a poster. But context changes everything. Because when a man says those words just days before his sudden death, they take on a whole new meaning. Fans flooded social media, replaying clips of him saying it, sharing the quote with captions like, "He knew," and "This broke me." It became impossible to separate his death from that message. His final words became part of his legacy. Think about it. Warner could have said anything. He could have spoken about upcoming projects. He could have reminisced about his career. He could have joked about life, the way Theo would have. Instead, he left us with the challenge to keep smiling and to give someone else a reason to smile, even when you can't find one yourself. And that's why fans are shattered, because it feels less like coincidence and more like fate. As if Malcolm Jamal Warner, in some way, sensed what was coming. It wouldn't be the first time a public figure left behind haunting last words. From Tupac to Chadwick Boseman, history is filled with truth-tellers and artists whose final messages gain more weight in hindsight. Warner has now joined that list. The announcement of his death shook Hollywood, but the echo of his final words shook his fans even harder.
Almost 10 years, and we have never had a fight, an argument, a raised voice, or a harsh word said to one
In
another.
10 years?
And it's not like we agree on everything.
Right.
She's Black and Puerto Rican. I've seen her with
Absolutely.
her family.
Yes.
Like, yeah, the smoke is there, the spice is there, but we're just, I think because we met later in life.
When people talk about Malcolm Jamal Warner's passing, they don't just talk about the accident in Costa Rica. They talk about his words, his final words, because unlike many celebrities whose last moments are kept private, Warner had already spoken publicly, openly in a way that feels almost prophetic. And now, those words are forever etched into the memory of his fans. Just days before his death, Warner recorded what would become his final podcast episode, and in it, he left behind a line that has since gone viral across social media. A line that fans keep replaying over and over again, with tears in their eyes. If you can't find a reason to smile, then be the reason somebody else does. On the surface, it sounds like the kind of motivational advice you might find on a greeting card. But when you really stop and listen, and when you place those words next to the heartbreaking news of his sudden death, it takes on a completely different meaning. This wasn't just a piece of advice. It was a farewell. The delivery matters. Friends who listened to the episode say Warner's tone was heavier than usual. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't casual. Instead, he spoke slowly, carefully, as though every word was being weighed. Like a man who knew these might be the last words he left behind. And when fans heard it after his passing, the reaction was immediate. Comment sections filled up with broken hearts and shattered emojis. Tweets read things like, "It feels like he was talking directly to us." Others wrote, "He knew his time was short." This wasn't just advice, it was a message. The haunting part is how perfectly those words reflect Warner's life. Think about it. For decades, he lived under the shadow of Hollywood scandals, particularly the downfall of Bill Cosby, a man who had been both his mentor and his on-screen father figure. He lost loved ones, including Michelle Thomas, the woman he once planned to marry, who died tragically young.
He endured heartbreaks, disappointments, and an industry that never fully gave him the credit he deserved. And yet, through it all, Malcolm Jamal Warner remained steady, grounded, calm. He wasn't in the tabloids for the wrong reasons. He wasn't spiraling like so many other child stars. He carried himself with quiet dignity, and he used his art, his music, his spoken word, his podcast to share wisdom that was bigger than himself.
So when he said, "If you can't find a reason to smile, then be the reason somebody else does," it wasn't just a catchy line. It was the philosophy of his life. A man who had every reason to be bitter, every reason to complain, instead chose to encourage others. That's what makes these words so devastating, because it feels like he was leaving us with the very essence of who he was. And that essence, kindness, resilience, and truth, is now all we have left. Fans described listening to that final podcast as a surreal experience. One person wrote online, "When he said those words, I had chills. It didn't hit me until after the news, but now can't unhear it. It's like he knew." Their fan commented, "I grew up watching Theo. I feel like I lost a brother. And hearing his last words, it broke me." Even fellow actors and musicians have echoed the sentiment, saying Warner's message was the perfect example of his character, thoughtful, grounded, and quietly powerful. And maybe that's why his final words sting so much. Because they weren't about fame. They weren't about money. They weren't about Hollywood at all. They were about humanity, about giving others light, even when you can't find it yourself. That's the part that makes fans feel completely shattered. Because in a world where so many final celebrity moments are clouded by scandal, Malcolm Jamal Warner left behind something pure, something uplifting, something that feels almost too good for the tragedy that followed. Now, when people share his quote online, it's not just as a memory, it's as a challenge. To keep smiling, to keep going, to carry forward the message of a man who didn't get the ending he deserved, but who left us with words that will outlive him. And the more you think about it, the more chilling it becomes. Because when someone's last words sound like they were meant to outlast them, you start to wonder, did he know? Did Malcolm Jamal Warner sense that his time was short? Was this his way of leaving a breadcrumb trail for us to follow? We may never know the answer, but one thing is undeniable. Those words will never be forgotten. And if Warner's legacy is measured not by the roles he played, not by the scandals he avoided, but by the message he left behind, then maybe his final words are the truest reflection of who he really was. Not just Theo Huxtable, not just an actor, but a man who believed in leaving the world a little brighter, even in his darkest hour.
What's good? Yes, I got the flower in my hair. Today's my daughter's birthday. She put the flower there, so I'm rocking it. What? It's a beautiful day here in Atlanta. I just wanted to shout out and just spread some love and some good cheer. And you know, life is out here lifing, right? For me and for everybody else. But just wanted to remind you, as I remind myself, that no matter what's going on, there's always a reason to smile. Like if you just take a minute to stop and take stock, I guarantee you can find at least one reason to smile.
For most celebrities, final words fade into footnotes. They're remembered briefly, quoted a few times, and then the world moves on. But with Malcolm Jamal Warner, it's different. His final words didn't just get remembered, they pierced through the hearts of millions, leaving fans in a state of grief that still hasn't healed. Why? Because for so many people, Malcolm wasn't just an actor, he was family. Let's rewind. In the 1980s, The Cosby Show wasn't just another sitcom. It was a cultural phenomenon. For the first time, American television audiences saw a black family portrayed not through stereotypes, but through warmth, humor, and relatability. And at the center of that family was Theo Huxtable, played by a young Malcolm Jamal Warner. To kids growing up in the 80s and 90s, Theo was the brother they wished they had, the classmate they felt like they knew, the teenager they could see themselves in. He wasn't perfect, he struggled with dyslexia, he made mistakes, he clashed with his parents, but that's exactly why people loved him. He was real, and as years went by, that connection never faded. Fans watched him grow up on screen, then quietly build a respectable career outside the spotlight. Unlike so many child stars who spiraled into scandals, Malcolm avoided the pitfalls. He became a symbol of resilience, discipline, and grace. So when news of his death hit, it wasn't like losing a distant celebrity. It felt personal. Fans described it like losing a cousin, an older brother, a childhood friend. The grief was raw. And then came the revelation of his final words. If you can't find a reason to smile, then be the reason somebody else does. That's when the heartbreak deepened, because it suddenly felt like he had been speaking directly to them, to the people who grew up with him, who laughed with him, who trusted him as part of their lives. Across social media, fans poured out their emotions. I feel like he left this for us, like he knew we needed it. This broke me. He gave us one last gift before leaving. He was my childhood. And these words feel like a goodbye letter to all of us. It wasn't just sadness, it was personal devastation. People who had never met him in real life cried, as if they had lost a family member. And in a way, they had. What makes this grief so powerful is the timing. His words came just days before his death. If he had spoken them months earlier, they might have been forgotten as just another piece of wisdom. But the proximity, the chilling closeness between his message and his passing, turned them into something else entirely, a farewell etched into history. And let's be honest, part of why fans are shattered is because Malcolm Jamal Warner represented something rare in Hollywood: stability. Think about it. How many child stars crash and burn? How many fall into addiction, legal troubles, or endless scandals? Warner avoided it all. He wasn't perfect, but he stayed grounded. He built a steady career, became a musician, a spoken word artist, a thoughtful voice in culture.
The heartbreak is also generational. Parents who grew up with Theo are now adults watching their own children discover reruns of The Cosby Show. Grandparents who once saw Warner as a teenager are now seeing his legacy cut short. His death became a marker of time, a reminder that childhood innocence doesn't last forever.
For many fans, the grief is tangled with nostalgia. They aren't just mourning Malcolm Jamal Warner the man, they're mourning their own youth, their memories of simpler times, their connection to a show that once represented hope. And that's why the phrase, "fans are completely shattered," isn't an exaggeration. It's the truth. This wasn't just another celebrity gone too soon. His final words were the last chapter of that bond, a bond that ended far too soon. But grief, as heavy as it is, often leads to reflection. And in the case of Malcolm Jamal Warner, fans aren't just crying over his death, they're reflecting on the legacy he left behind. The legacy of truth, survival, and quiet excellence.
Because when you really think about it, those final words weren't just heartbreaking, they were empowering. And that's where his story turns from tragedy into something bigger.
And if for some reason you can't find a reason to smile, then that's probably the best time to be the reason for somebody else to smile. So, find a smile for yourself and be a reason for someone else to smile. That's all I got. Listen to love because it's been a minute. Peace and love, and I'll be back soon.
When a public figure passes away, the meaning of their last words always echoes louder than anything that came before. But in Malcolm Jamal Warner's case, those words strike especially deep because they are perfectly aligned with the life he lived, the choices he made, and the battles he endured quietly, away from the spotlight. To truly understand why his final words matter, you have to look at the legacy behind them. Malcolm Jamal Warner wasn't just Theo Huxtable. Yes, he will always be remembered as the wisecracking son of the Cosby family, the kid America watched grow up week after week. But Warner's story didn't end when The Cosby Show went off the air. In fact, that's when the real journey began. And it was not an easy road. When you think about the trajectory of most child stars, the story is often tragic. Fame at a young age, struggles with identity, pressure from Hollywood, temptations, addictions, and all too often, a tragic downfall. But Warner avoided that fate. He chose another path, one built on discipline, reflection, and purpose. This is why his final words, "If you can't find a reason to smile, then be the reason somebody else does," hit so hard. They weren't empty, they were lived. For years, Warner balanced the weight of being tied to a cultural juggernaut with the need to prove he was more than just Theo. And if that wasn't enough, he carried the shadow of the Bill Cosby scandal, a storm that destroyed the legacy of the very show that made him famous. Imagine that. The role that defined your career, the show that made you a household name, suddenly poisoned by association with one man's crimes. Warner didn't cause it, he didn't choose it, but he had to live with it. And his response? He didn't lash out, he didn't sensationalize. He spoke carefully, with compassion for victims, but also honesty about the personal pain of seeing something so important to Black culture erased from television history. He once admitted the cancellation of syndication wasn't just cultural, it was financial. "It's literally taking money out of my pocket," he said. But even then, he didn't spiral. He carried himself with quiet dignity. That's the first layer of his legacy, resilience in the face of an unfair burden. Then there's the personal side. Warner wasn't spared from heartbreak. He lost Michelle Thomas, his former girlfriend and Cosby Show co-star, to cancer when she was just 30 years old. It was a devastating loss, one he carried quietly, far from the tabloids. Later, his high-profile breakup with Regina King played out in public, adding another layer of pain. But again, he didn't let these tragedies define him. He pulled back, guarded his privacy, and focused on growth. That's the second layer of his legacy, surviving heartbreak with grace. And then, there's his artistry. Warner wasn't content to ride on the nostalgia of his childhood fame. He became a director, a musician, a spoken word artist. He explored serious issues: racism, mass incarceration, entity in his work. He even won a Grammy. These weren't vanity projects. They were purposeful. They were rooted in the same message his final words carried: endurance, survival, and being a light for others. That's the third layer of his legacy, using art to reveal truth. When you put all of this together, resilience in career, grace in personal life, in purpose and artistry, you begin to see why his final words resonate so powerfully. They weren't random. They weren't just something nice to say. They were the distilled essence of who Malcolm Jamal Warner was. A man who endured shadows without becoming bitter. A man who survived heartbreak without turning destructive. A man who created art not for fame, but for meaning. So when he said, "If you can't find a reason to smile, then be the reason somebody else does," fans didn't just hear advice. They heard the voice of someone who had lived it. Someone who knew what it meant to find light in darkness. Someone who practiced what he preached. That's why fans described feeling completely shattered. Because when a man whose whole life reflected resilience leaves you with the final message of hope, and then is gone, you realize that message is now a responsibility. It's a torch passed on. And maybe that is the truest legacy of Malcolm Jamal Warner. Not just the roles he played, not just the headlines tied to his name, but the message he lived and left behind. That even in struggle, even in grief, even in the face of silence, you can still choose to be someone else's reason to smile. That's a legacy that can't be erased.
I remember my mother said to me one time that Mr. Cosby gave you immortality, but then because I've had this full life, after that show, there's another lane of legacy that I get to leave. There is part of me that I will be able to leave this earth, knowing and people knowing that I was a good person.
Because if you look at history, Warner is not the first, and sadly, he won't be the last. Think about Chadwick Boseman. Here was an actor at the absolute height of his career, redefining what it meant to be a black superhero in Black Panther, portraying icons like Jackie Robinson and Thurgood Marshall. Yet behind the scenes, he was fighting a private battle with cancer. He knew his time was limited, but he chose to spend his final years pouring everything he had into roles that would inspire generations. When his death was announced, fans were stunned. But when people looked back at his interviews, his words suddenly felt prophetic, as though he had been preparing us all along. Now think about Nipsey Hussle, a rapper, entrepreneur, an activist who preached ownership, community investment, and financial independence. He wasn't just making music. He was building a blueprint for others to follow. And then, just as his message was gaining momentum, he was gunned down outside his own store in Los Angeles. In the days that followed, his lyrics, interviews, and speeches were re-examined, and what fans discovered was a breadcrumb trail of warnings, wisdom, and legacy building that felt like a farewell in disguise. And then, of course, forward. And that's where the pattern flips from despair to responsibility. Because if you look closely, the legacies of Boseman, Nipsey, Tupac, and others didn't end with their deaths. Their words, their art, their wisdom, it outlived them. It inspired new generations. It became louder, not quieter. Maybe that's why Warner's words matter so much. Because they, too, were designed to outlast him. Because they, too, were designed to outlast him. Because even if he didn't know what was coming, he made sure to leave behind a message that would continue to resonate. And that's what makes this pattern both haunting and hopeful. Haunting, because it reminds us of how fragile our truth tellers are. Hopeful, because it proves that their voices cannot be erased. Warner's final words weren't just his. They're now ours, a part of the same long lineage of artists and leaders who left us too soon, but left behind enough light to guide us forward. And maybe, just maybe, that's what he wanted all along. Malcolm Jamal Warner's death left a silence, but his words, his final words, filled that silence with something unforgettable. If you can't find a reason to smile, then be the reason somebody else does. Simple, direct. But when placed against the backdrop of his sudden passing, those words become heavier than anything he ever said on screen or on stage. They remind us of the fragility of life. They remind us of the power of kindness. And they remind us that even in our darkest hours, we can still be the light for someone else. That's why fans are shattered, because Malcolm Jamal Warner wasn't just leaving advice, he was leaving a legacy. A legacy built not on scandals or fame, but on resilience, wisdom, and truth. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us, to take those final words and live them, to carry his torch forward and let us by know becoming reasons for others to smile, Malcolm Jamal even Warner's when we feel broken ourselves, to you personally. Because Warner may be every comment, but his voice and your thoughts keep these conversations still alive. And if we truly listen, remember his message, act, be the reason somebody else not just comfort us, and never forget the truth left behind. Thank you for watching Behind the Mask. If this video moved you, please take a second to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the stories Hollywood doesn't want to tell.